The convoy rolled through the narrow valley pass like a line of ants crawling through a crack in concrete. 5 armored vehicles, heavily loaded with American Special Operations personnel, equipment crates, and enough ammunition to level a small town. The morning sun had just broken over the eastern ridgeline, painting the rocky terrain in shades of amber and rust. It should have been routine, just another supply run through hostile territory. But routine had a way of becoming catastrophic in the blink of an eye. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb sat in the lead vehicle, scanning the high ground through polarized sunglasses. 22 years in the Navy SEALs had given him a sixth sense for danger, and right now that sense was screaming at him through every nerve in his body. The terrain was textbook ambush country, steep walls on both sides, limited maneuverability, countless hiding spots for enemy fighters to rain hell down on passing targets. "I don't like this," he muttered into his radio. "Too quiet." Behind him in the second vehicle, Petty Officer First Class Jada Morales adjusted her plate carrier and checked her rifle for the third time in 10 minutes. At 29, she was younger than most of the men in her unit, but her reputation had been forged in the crucible of combat across 3 continents. Dark hair pulled back in a tactical bun, brown eyes that missed nothing, and a shooting record that made instructors at Quantico shake their heads in disbelief. She wasn't supposed to be here, not officially anyway. Her primary assignment was intelligence analysis, sitting in air-conditioned rooms, studying satellite imagery, and building target packages for operators to execute. But when the convoy had been short one qualified shooter, and when someone mentioned they might be rolling through disputed territory, she'd volunteered without hesitation. "Relax, Webb," came the voice of Lieutenant Commander James Pritchard over the radio. "Intel says this area's been quiet for weeks. We'll be through in 20 minutes. Jada's eyes narrowed. In her experience, intel that said things were quiet was usually intel that hadn't been updated in time to save lives. She shifted in her seat, adjusting the custom rifle that rested between her knees. It wasn't standard military issue, a modified platform she'd built herself over years of refinement. Longer barrel for distance, custom trigger for precision, scope that cost more than most people's cars. The first RPG round hit the third vehicle in the convoy at 0847 hours. The explosion was immediate and devastating, a bloom of orange fire and black smoke that sent the armored truck lurching sideways. The blast wave rolled over the convoy like a physical thing, rattling teeth and stunning eardrums. Before anyone could react, automatic weapons fire erupted from both sides of the valley. Hundreds of rounds per minute, coordinated and professional, tearing into vehicles and equipment with brutal efficiency. "Contact! Contact! Both sides!" Webb's voice cut through the chaos as he returned fire through his window. "We're in a kill box." Jada was already moving. Her door flew open and she rolled out behind the vehicle's engine block, using the heavy metal as cover while bullets sparked off armor plating and shattered windows. Her rifle came up smooth and fast, scope-finding targets before conscious thought could catch up. Enemy fighters were positioned in elevated positions on both sides of the pass, maybe 30 or 40 of them, spread across multiple firing points. They'd waited until the convoy was perfectly positioned before springing the trap. Professional, disciplined. The kind of enemy that knew exactly what they were doing. The SEALs were returning fire, but it was suppression rather than elimination. Bullets flying everywhere, keeping heads down, but not actually solving the fundamental problem. They were trapped in a funnel with nowhere to go and enemies who held every advantage. "We need to move," Pritchard shouted over the radio. "Forward or back, but we can't stay here." "Both routes are covered." Webb fired a burst toward a muzzle flash. "The moment we break cover, they'll cut us to pieces." That's when Jada saw it. A slight gap in the enemy's overlapping fields of fire, a blind spot created by the terrain itself. If someone could reach that ridgeline, they could flank the primary firing positions and take pressure off the convoy. It was a long shot, maybe 300 meters of exposed ground, uphill under fire. Suicidal for most people. But Jada Morales had never been most people. "I'm moving," she said into her radio, not asking permission because she knew they'd tell her no. "Cover me." She didn't wait for a response. Her body was already in motion, rifle slung across her chest, moving in a combat crouch that kept her profile low and her momentum forward. The SEALs, to their credit, immediately understood what she was attempting and poured fire into the enemy positions to keep their heads down. Bullets snapped past her head, close enough to feel the pressure waves. Rock chips exploded at her feet. The world compressed into a tunnel of sensory overload. The burning in her lungs, the weight of her gear, the mathematical calculation of angles and vectors that her brain was processing faster than conscious thought. She dove behind a boulder as a burst of automatic fire stitched the ground where she'd been standing a heartbeat before. Her heart was hammering, but her hands were steady. Always steady. She'd learned a long time ago that fear was just information, and information could be managed. A quick glance around the boulder showed her the next piece of cover, a depression in the ground about 20 meters ahead. She could make it. Probably. The SEALs were still laying down suppressive fire, giving her the window she needed. Jida exploded from behind the boulder, sprinting in a zigzag pattern that made her harder to track. More bullets, more near misses. The depression rushed up to meet her, and she slid into it like a baseball player stealing home. From this position, she had a clear line of sight to 3 enemy firing positions. Her rifle came off her shoulder and into her hands with practiced efficiency. She settled into the dirt, controlled her breathing, and let the world slow down the way it always did when she was behind a scope. First target. Fighter positioned behind sandbags, maybe 250 meters out. She could see the muzzle flash of his weapon, could track the slight movements of his body as he adjusted his aim. Her crosshairs settled on the small portion of his head, visible above the sandbags. The shot was clean. The fighter dropped without a sound that could be heard over the ongoing firefight. 1 down. Second target, another fighter, this one in a more exposed position, trying to move closer to get a better angle on the convoy. Jida's rifle tracked him smoothly, leading his movement by just the right amount to account for distance and velocity. Her finger found the trigger. Another shot. Another kill. The enemy started to realize something was wrong. Their carefully orchestrated ambush was being disrupted by precise fire from an unexpected angle. Some of them began to reposition, trying to locate the new threat. But Jida was already transitioning to her third target, a fighter who was setting up what looked like a heavy machine gun. If that weapon got into action, it could tear through the convoy's armor like tissue paper. She couldn't allow that. The range was longer this time, almost 300 meters. Wind was picking up, pushing from left to right. She made a tiny adjustment to her scope, compensated for the wind drift, and fired. The fighter collapsed across his weapon, 3 down in less than 30 seconds. Now, the enemy knew they were being flanked. Several fighters turned their attention toward Jida's position, sending a storm of lead in her direction. She pressed herself into the depression as bullets ripped through the air overhead and punched holes in the rocky ground around her. Over the radio, she heard Webb's voice. "Morales, what's your status?" "I'm fine," she said, her voice calm despite the metal flying past her head. "I've disrupted their left flank. If you can push forward now, you'll have an opening." "Negative. We've got casualties here. We need—" The radio cut off as another explosion rocked the convoy. Jida risked a glance and saw smoke pouring from one of the vehicles. The situation was deteriorating fast. They needed to break contact, but the enemy wasn't giving them room to breathe. She scanned through her scope again, prioritizing targets. The fighters using the heaviest weapons, the ones in positions to do the most damage, the ones who looked like they were directing others. Her rifle spoke again, and again, and again. Each shot was deliberate. Each shot was final. She wasn't spraying bullets and hoping for hits. She was selecting targets with surgical precision and eliminating them with mechanical efficiency. Her magazine ran dry, and she reloaded without taking her eyes from the scope, muscle memory allowing her hands to function independently of conscious thought. The enemy's coordinated fire was beginning to fracture. Gaps were appearing in their coverage. Individual fighters were making decisions based on fear rather than training, and fear made people predictable. "Webb," she said into her radio, "I'm going to push further up the ridgeline. When I start firing again, move the convoy forward as fast as you can. Don't stop. Don't look back. Just Move. Morales, you can't. Trust me. She was already moving again, using the temporary suppression of enemy fire to gain more ground. Her legs burned with the effort of climbing while carrying 50 pounds of gear. Sweat ran down her face despite the cool morning air. But she kept moving, because stopping meant dying, and dying meant failing the people depending on her. She reached an outcropping of rock that gave her an elevated position overlooking the entire kill zone. From here, she could see everything: the trapped convoy, the enemy positions, the terrain that channeled movement and dictated tactics. Jada settled into a prone position and became absolutely still. Her breathing slowed. Her heartbeat steadied. The chaos of combat faded into background noise as she entered that focused state where nothing existed except her, the rifle, and the target. She began to work through enemy positions methodically, starting with the ones that posed the greatest threat to the convoy's escape route. Each shot was placed with mathematical precision: center mass when the target was close, headshots when they were behind cover, leading moving targets by exactly the right amount to account for their speed and direction. The enemy fighters began to panic. They couldn't see her clearly from their positions, couldn't pinpoint exactly where the devastating fire was coming from. All they knew was that their friends were dropping with terrifying regularity, and the invisible sniper seemed to anticipate their movements before they made them. Some of them tried to flee. Jada let them go. She wasn't here to rack up a body count. She was here to save American lives. The ones who continued to fight, who continued to threaten the convoy, those were the ones who found themselves in her crosshairs. Below, the convoy was moving. The remaining vehicles ground forward through the pass, engines roaring, weapons still firing. They were taking casualties, but they were moving, and movement meant survival. Jada provided overwatch, her rifle swinging from target to target with fluid economy. A fighter trying to hit the convoy with an RPG, dead. Another attempting to reposition a machine gun, dead. Two more trying to set up an ambush position further down the pass, dead and dead. Her magazine ran dry again. She reloaded, the motion so automatic she could have done it in her sleep. 12 rounds left in this magazine, probably her last before she'd need to start rationing ammunition. The convoy was almost through the kill zone now. Just a few more seconds and they'd be clear. But the enemy had one more trick up their sleeve. A fighter popped up from a concealed position directly in the convoy's path, RPG already on his shoulder, rocket loaded and ready to fire. At this range, he couldn't miss. One of those vehicles would be destroyed and everyone inside would die in the explosion. Jada's scope found him immediately. Her crosshairs settled on the small target area, just his head and shoulders visible above the rocks. The range was extreme, nearly 400 meters. The shot would have to be perfect. She exhaled half a breath and held it. Her finger caressed the trigger with exactly the right pressure. The world contracted to a single point of absolute focus. The rifle fired. The fighter dropped like someone had cut his strings. The RPG clattered harmlessly to the ground, unfired. Below, the convoy roared past the position where they would have been destroyed and continued into the relative safety of the wider valley beyond. They were clear. Jada remained in position, scanning for any remaining threats. The enemy fighters who were still alive had melted back into the rocks, unwilling to continue fighting against an opponent they couldn't locate or counter. The ambush had been broken, the kill box had been escaped, and American forces were withdrawing to fight another day. She keyed her radio. "Webb, you're clear. I'm moving to rejoin." "Negative, Morales. Stay put. We're coming back for you." "Don't be stupid. You've got wounded who need medical attention. I'll find my own way back." "That's not going to happen. Hold your position. That's an order." Jada smiled despite herself. The SEALs took care of their own, even when their own was an intelligence analyst who'd just saved their collective asses. She scanned the surrounding terrain one more time, confirmed that the immediate threat had passed, then settled in to wait. Her hands were rock steady as she reloaded her rifle and checked her remaining ammunition. 38 rounds left. Not great, but enough to discourage anyone stupid enough to come looking for her. The adrenaline was starting to fade now, replaced by the familiar post-combat exhaustion that made everything feel heavy and distant. Her body was reminding her that she'd just sprinted 300 meters uphill under fire, then spent 20 minutes in a gunfight that should have been impossible to survive. But she had survived. They all had. And that was what mattered. The sound of engines approached from the valley below. The convoy was indeed coming back, one of the vehicles peeling off to navigate up the ridgeline toward her position. Giada stood slowly, slinging her rifle across her chest, and began the careful climb down to meet them. The aftermath. The vehicle that came for Giada was the second truck in the convoy, driven by Petty Officer Second Class Ryan Torres. He pulled up beside her position with a spray of gravel and leaned out the window, his face streaked with dirt and dried blood from a cut above his eyebrow. "You're either the bravest person I've ever met or the craziest," he said, but he was grinning. "Maybe both." Giada climbed into the passenger seat without ceremony. "Just another day at the office." "The hell it is." Torres put the vehicle in gear and started navigating back down the ridge. "I've been doing this job for 12 years. Never seen shooting like that, not from anyone." She didn't respond, just watched the terrain roll past as they descended. The ambush site was visible below, scattered equipment, shell casings glinting in the sun, dark stains on the rocks that would wash away with the next rain, evidence of violence that would fade, but never fully disappear. The convoy had stopped in a defensive position about a kilometer from the ambush site. Giada could see medics working on wounded personnel, could hear the chatter of radio communications as higher command was updated on the situation. The third vehicle that had been hit by the initial RPG was still smoldering, a total loss. As Torres pulled their vehicle into the defensive perimeter, Chief Webb was already walking toward them. His face was grim, but there was something else in his eyes, a mixture of gratitude and disbelief that Giada had seen before in people who'd just witnessed something that didn't fit into their understanding of reality. "Morales," he said as she dismounted, "we need to talk." They walked a short distance from the other personnel, far enough for privacy, but close enough to maintain security. Webb studied her for a long moment before speaking. "That was some of the most impressive marksmanship I've ever seen," he said bluntly. "And I've worked with the best shooters in SOCOM. How is it that an intelligence analyst shoots better than my entire sniper element?" Giada had known this conversation was coming. The problem with demonstrating exceptional skills was that people started asking questions, and some questions had answers that were classified above most people's pay grades. "I qualify with my rifle," she said carefully, "same as everyone else." "Don't insult me." Webb's voice was flat. "Qualifying is hitting targets at 200 meters on a flat range in perfect conditions. What you just did was combat shooting at extended ranges under maximum stress with moving targets and poor angles. It's not something you learn by qualifying once a year." She met his gaze steadily. "Then maybe you should ask yourself why someone with my skill set is officially assigned to intelligence analysis." Understanding dawned in Webb's eyes. "You're not regular Navy." "I'm whatever the Navy needs me to be on any given day." "Special operations?" "I'm a petty officer first class assigned to intelligence analysis," Giada repeated, her voice neutral. "That's what my service record says. That's what I am." Webb recognized the wall when he hit it. There were things in the military that people weren't supposed to ask about, positions that didn't officially exist, programs that operated in shadows so deep that even senior leadership sometimes didn't know the full picture. If Giada Morales was part of something like that, pushing for answers would only cause problems for everyone. "Right," he said after a pause. "Intelligence analysis? My mistake." "No mistake, Chief. Just operational security." He nodded slowly. "For what it's worth, thanks. You saved a lot of lives today." "Just doing my job." "If your job is saving SEAL teams from ambushes, you're very good at it." Giada allowed herself a small smile. "I'll make a note in my after-action report that the training is working." Lieutenant Commander Pritchard joined them, his uniform torn and stained with someone else's blood. He'd been helping the medics treat the wounded. His expression was strained but composed, the face of someone who'd just lost people under his command and was holding himself together through sheer professionalism. Final count, he said without preamble. 3 KIA, 7 wounded. Could have been a lot worse. It would have been worse, Webb said, gesturing toward Jada. If Morales hadn't done what she did, we'd have lost everyone. Pritchard studied her with new interest. I owe you an apology. When you volunteered for this convoy, I thought you were just looking for something to put in your service jacket. I was wrong. No apology necessary, sir. You didn't know. But that's the thing, I should have known. Your file came across my desk with enough redactions to make the CIA jealous. I assumed it was bureaucratic bullshit. Apparently it wasn't. Jada said nothing. Sometimes silence was the only appropriate response. Pritchard continued. Whatever you actually do when you're not analyzing intelligence, I hope someone appreciates it, because what you did today was extraordinary. Someone appreciates it, Jada said quietly. That's all that matters. The medevac helicopters arrived 20 minutes later, Blackhawks that came in fast and low with door gunners scanning for threats. The wounded were loaded quickly and professionally, priorities based on triage categories. The 3 who hadn't survived were handled with the dignity and respect that fallen warriors deserved, body bags sealed and carried with careful reverence. Jada stood back from the activity, watching the organized chaos of military logistics in action. This was the part that never made it into the mission reports, the cleanup, the accounting, the aftermath of violence. People focused on the gunfights and the heroics, but it was the aftermath that stayed with you. The faces of the wounded, the weight of the body bags, the knowledge that people had died today and tomorrow their families would receive notifications that would shatter their worlds. Torres approached her as the helicopters lifted off, rotors beating the air into submission. They're saying you took out at least 15 fighters, maybe more. I didn't count. Bullshit, shooters always count. She looked at him directly. Then let's say I lost count somewhere around enough to get everyone out alive. That's the only number that matters. He studied her face, trying to read something in her expression. Who are you really? I'm Petty Officer First Class Jada Morales, assigned to intelligence analysis at... Yeah, I know the party line. He shook his head. But someday, when the classified stuff isn't classified anymore, I want to hear the real story. If that day comes, I'll buy you a beer and tell you everything. I'm going to hold you to that. The convoy reformed an hour later, minus 1 vehicle, and with a lot more empty seats than they'd started with. The mood was somber but determined, the particular mindset of people who'd just survived something terrible and were committed to honoring the fallen by continuing the mission. Jada took her seat in the same vehicle she'd started in, though now Torres was driving and Webb was riding shotgun. The return journey would follow a different route, already cleared by a quick reaction force that had deployed the moment the ambush was reported. No chances were being taken this time. As they rolled out, Webb turned in his seat to look at her. One more question. Shoot. When you moved from cover to cover during the firefight, you were running through an active kill zone with bullets flying everywhere. How did you stay so calm? Jada considered the question. Because panic gets you killed. Fear is just information. It tells you where the danger is. Once you accept that danger exists, you can make rational decisions about how to navigate it. That's not something they teach in basic training. No, she agreed, it's not. Where did you learn it? Classified, Chief. He laughed, though there wasn't much humor in it. Everything about you is classified. Not everything. You know I prefer my coffee black. That's not classified. Good to know we're sharing the important secrets. The convoy made it back to the forward operating base without incident. As they passed through the security gates and entered the relative safety of the fortified perimeter, Jada felt some of the tension drain from her shoulders. They'd made it. Not everyone, but enough. In this business, that sometimes had to be sufficient. Debriefing took 3 hours. Jada sat in a small room with Pritchard, Webb, and 2 intelligence officers who wanted to know every detail of the ambush, the enemy tactics, and the response. She provided information efficiently and without embellishment, sticking to observable facts and avoiding speculation. When they asked about her actions during the firefight, she kept her responses technical and professional. Range to targets, wind conditions, ammunition expenditure, the mechanics of shooting without the emotional weight of what shooting meant. The intelligence officers took careful notes, but asked no questions about her background or training. Either they already knew and didn't need to ask, or they'd been briefed to avoid certain topics. Either way, Giada was grateful for the professional courtesy. When the debriefing finally ended, Pritchard stopped her at the door. "One more thing. Your actions today are going into my official report, and I'm recommending you for a commendation." "That's not necessary, sir." "Yes, it is. Good work deserves recognition." "My work is most effective when it's not recognized," he smiled grimly. "Then I'll make sure the commendation stays at an appropriate classification level. But it's going in the record, Morales. You earned it." She nodded, knowing that arguing further would be disrespectful. "Thank you, sir." Outside the debriefing room, the sun was setting over the base, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Giada walked toward her quarters slowly, her body finally acknowledging the toll of the day's events. Every muscle ached, her ears were still ringing from sustained weapons fire. She could feel bruises forming where her plate carrier had absorbed impacts during her sprint up the ridgeline. But she was alive. They were alive. And tomorrow they'd do it all over again. Her quarters were sparse: a cot, a footlocker, a small desk with a laptop secured by multiple layers of encryption. She set her rifle carefully against the wall, then sat on the edge of the cot and began the process of removing her gear. Body armor came off first, plate carrier with its ceramic plates that had protected her from bullets she'd never know about. Then, her battle belt with magazine pouches and medical supplies, and all the small items that could mean the difference between life and death in combat. When she was down to her base uniform, she allowed herself to close her eyes for just a moment. Behind her eyelids, she could still see the ambush site, could still feel the rifle's recoil against her shoulder, could still remember the precise moment when her crosshairs had settled on each target and she'd made the decision to fire. Those moments would join all the other moments in the catalog of violence she carried with her. Not with pride and not with shame, but with the pragmatic acceptance that this was the job she'd chosen. Someone had to be willing to do the difficult things. Someone had to stand between chaos and the people who needed protecting. Today, that someone had been her. A knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. "It's open." Torres stepped inside, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the mess hall. He offered her one without a word. She accepted it gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm cup and inhaling the steam. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. "Won't be sleeping for a while." He sat in the room's only chair, which creaked under his weight. "Every time I close my eyes, I see that RPG hitting our truck. See the explosion. Think about how if we'd been 30 seconds slower if you hadn't been there. But I was there, and you weren't 30 seconds slower. What ifs don't help. How do you do it?" He stared into his coffee like it might have answers. "Go through something like that and then just continue. Like it's normal." "It's not normal," Giada said quietly. "It's necessary. There's a difference." "What made you volunteer for this convoy? You had to know it was dangerous." "Because someone needed to, and I had the skills to make a difference." Torres looked up at her. "You know what Webb's saying? He's saying you're probably the best combat shooter he's ever seen. And he's worked with some legends." Webb exaggerates. "No, he doesn't. That's not who he is." Torres leaned forward. "So I'll ask you again. Who are you really? Because the official story isn't adding up." Giada sipped her coffee, considering how much to say. The truth was complicated and mostly classified, but Torres had earned some honesty, even if it couldn't be complete. "I'm someone who was trained to do a specific job," she said carefully. "That job requires certain skills. Shooting is one of them. When situations arise where those skills are needed, I use them. And the specific job is classified. Very. But it's not intelligence analysis. It's whatever the mission requires on any given day. Sometimes that's analysis, sometimes it's other things." Torres nodded slowly, processing this. "The people who trained you, they must be very good at what they do. The best in the world. And they taught you to shoot like that. Among other things." He was quiet for a long moment then. "I'm glad you were with us today. Whatever your real job is, I'm glad it put you on that convoy. So am I. They finished their coffee in comfortable silence. When Torres finally stood to leave, he paused at the door. For what it's worth, if you ever need backup for whatever classified mission comes next, I'd volunteer. I'll keep that in mind. After he left, Jada sat alone in the dim room, finishing her coffee and staring at nothing in particular. The day's events played through her mind on an automatic loop. Every decision, every shot, every moment where things could have gone differently. She'd made the right calls. The outcome proved that. But the weight of those decisions didn't disappear just because they'd been correct. Every life she'd taken today had been necessary, justified, legal under the rules of engagement. But necessity didn't make it easy. Justification didn't erase the reality of what she'd done. This was the part of the job that people didn't talk about. The psychological cost of violence, even righteous violence. The way it accumulated over time like sediment in a river, slowly building up until you had to decide how to carry that weight. Some people couldn't carry it. They broke under the pressure, or they walked away, or they found themselves unable to pull the trigger when the next situation demanded it. Jada had seen it happen to people who seemed stronger than she was, more resilient, more naturally suited to this life. But she was still here, still carrying the weight, still willing to do what needed to be done when the situation demanded it. Her phone buzzed, a secure message from a contact listed only as command. The message was brief. Well done. Full debrief upon return to main base, travel orders to follow. She typed a quick acknowledgement, then deleted both messages from her phone's memory. Whatever came next would come next. For now, she needed rest. Jada set her empty coffee cup on the desk, kicked off her boots and lay back on the cot, fully clothed. Sleep came quickly despite the ringing in her ears and the adrenaline still slowly draining from her system. She dreamed of nothing, which was a mercy. 3 days later, the C-130 transport plane that carried Jada back to the main base was crowded with personnel rotating out of forward positions. She sat near the rear ramp, her rifle case secured between her knees, watching the landscape scroll past 30,000 feet below. Afghanistan looked almost peaceful from this altitude, brown mountains giving way to valleys, rivers cutting through terrain like silver threads, small villages clustered around water sources. It was easy to forget from up here that people were fighting and dying down there, that violence was erupting in those peaceful-looking valleys, that the beauty of the landscape hid dangers that could kill you in a heartbeat. A young Marine corporal in the seat next to her kept glancing at her rifle case with obvious curiosity. Finally, he worked up the courage to speak. "That custom work?" "Yeah. You a sniper?" "I shoot when shooting needs to be done." He laughed nervously. "That's not really an answer. It's the only answer I can give." "Classified stuff?" "The classiest." That got a real laugh from him, breaking some of the tension. "I'm Jake. Just finished my first deployment." "Jada, not my first." "Any advice for someone who's just starting out?" She considered the question seriously. The kid was maybe 19, young enough that combat still seemed like an adventure instead of a grinding responsibility. He deserved honest advice, not the romanticized bullshit that got people killed. "Stay humble," she said finally. "The moment you think you've figured everything out is the moment you make a fatal mistake. Listen to the people who've been doing this longer than you. Take care of your equipment and your people. And remember that luck runs out eventually, so never rely on it." Jake absorbed this thoughtfully. "That it?" "One more thing. Remember why you're doing this. When things get hard, and they will get hard, you need to have a reason beyond just following orders, something that keeps you anchored when everything else is chaos." "What's your reason?" Jada looked out the small window at the landscape below. "Because someone has to be willing to do difficult things so other people don't have to. That's enough for me." The plane banked, beginning its descent toward the main airbase. The conversation ended as personnel began securing their gear and preparing for landing. Jada checked her rifle case one more time, then settled back to wait. The base was massive compared to the forward operating positions, permanent structures instead of temporary shelters, better food, actual recreational facilities. It was a reminder that even in war zones, there were gradations of comfort and safety. Jada's travel orders directed her to a nondescript building near the intelligence center. She reported as instructed, showing her identification to multiple layers of security before being escorted to a small conference room deep in the building's interior. The woman waiting for her was in civilian clothes, though everything about her posture and bearing said military. 40s, sharp eyes, the kind of face that revealed nothing unless she wanted it to. Her identification card hung from a lanyard, but was turned backward, hiding her name and position. "Petty Officer Morales," the woman said. "Please, sit." Jada sat, setting her rifle case carefully on the floor beside her chair. "I've read the reports from your convoy," the woman continued. "Very impressive work. Lieutenant Commander Pritchard speaks highly of your actions." "I did what was necessary." "You did considerably more than necessary. You single-handedly broke an ambush that should have wiped out that entire convoy." She opened a folder on the table, scanning documents that Jada couldn't see. 15 confirmed kills at ranges up to 400 meters under adverse conditions with multiple moving targets. That's exceptional, even by our standards. "Thank you." "The problem," the woman said, her tone shifting slightly, "is that exceptional performance draws attention. And attention is something we generally try to avoid in your line of work." Jada had expected this. The alternative was letting American personnel die. "I'm not criticizing your decision. You saved lives, and that's always the right call. But now we have SEALs asking questions about who you are and what you really do. We have reports being written that will get read by people at very high levels. We have attention. What are you recommending?" The woman closed the folder. "Your cover as an intelligence analyst is probably still viable, but it's compromised around anyone who was on that convoy. We're pulling you back to the States for reassignment. You'll continue with your official duties, but we'll be more careful about where and when we deploy you for special operations." "When do I leave?" "Transport's already arranged. You fly out tomorrow morning." She studied Jada's face, looking for a reaction that never came. "You're taking this well." "I knew the assignment was temporary." "Most people would be disappointed about leaving a combat zone. You sound almost relieved." Jada considered how to respond. "I'm not relieved that I'm leaving. I'm satisfied that I did the job and did it well. What comes next is what comes next." The woman smiled slightly. "That's the right attitude for this work. Keep that attitude, and you'll have a long career." She stood, offering her hand. "Good work, Petty Officer. Truly exceptional." They shook hands. The woman's grip was firm and professional. "One more thing," Jada said before the woman could leave. "The Marines who died in that ambush, do their families get the full story?" "They get what we're authorized to tell them, that their loved ones died in combat, that they were heroes, that their sacrifice mattered. The specific details of the ambush and the response," she shrugged slightly. "Some things stay classified. Even from families? Especially from families. Operational security doesn't have exceptions for grief." It wasn't the answer Jada wanted, but it was the answer she expected. In this business, truth was commodified and controlled. Even death had classification levels. The rest of her time at the base passed quickly. Jada packed her gear, submitted final reports, and said goodbye to the few people who knew her well enough to warrant goodbyes. Most of her work had been done in isolation, her real missions conducted without witnesses, her actual contributions known only to a handful of people with the right clearances. On her last evening, she walked the perimeter of the base as the sun set. The mountains in the distance turned purple and gold, beautiful in that stark way that dangerous places often were. She'd spent months here, living in the tension between her official duties and her classified missions, maintaining the fiction of who she was supposed to be while doing the work that actually mattered. It had been exhausting, rewarding, necessary. And now it was ending, at least this chapter of it. Torres found her near the flight line, where helicopters were being prepped for night operations. "Heard you're leaving tomorrow." "News travels fast. Small community, even smaller when someone does what you did." He kicked at the dirt with his boot. "We're going to miss having you around. Feels safer knowing you're watching our backs." "You'll be fine. Webb's a good chief. Pritchard's a solid commander. You've got good people. We did have good people. Then we lost 3 of them because we walked into an ambush. His voice was heavy with the guilt that survivors always carried. If you hadn't been there, but I was there, that's what matters. Is it? He looked at her directly. 3 families are getting visits from casualty notification officers. 3 sets of parents or spouses or kids are having their worlds destroyed. And the only reason it's not more families is because you happened to volunteer for a convoy that you had no official reason to be on. Giada understood what he was really asking. You're wondering if there's some bigger plan, some reason why things happen the way they do, I guess? There isn't. There's just people making decisions and living with the consequences. I made a decision to volunteer. You made decisions during the firefight. The enemy made decisions about where to set their ambush. All of those decisions intersected in ways that determined who lived and who died. That's all it is, decisions and consequences. That's a pretty cold way to look at it. It's the only way to look at it and stay functional. If you start trying to find cosmic meaning in chaos, you'll drive yourself crazy. Torres was quiet for a moment, processing this. The beer offer still stands. When this is all over and the classified stuff doesn't matter anymore, I want to hear the real story. I'll hold you to that. He extended his hand. She shook it firmly. Stay safe, Morales, whatever you end up doing next. You too, Torres. Keep your head down and your powder dry. He smiled at the old expression, then walked back toward the barracks. Giada watched him go, then returned her attention to the helicopters. Their rotors were spinning up now, the distinctive whop-whop-whop of Blackhawks preparing for takeoff. Somewhere out there in the darkness, those helicopters would be carrying people into danger. Maybe they'd complete their mission without incident. Maybe they'd run into trouble and need someone to pull their asses out of the fire. The uncertainty was the only constant in this business. Tomorrow she'd be on a transport back to the States, back to briefing rooms and training ranges, and the peculiar double life of someone whose official duties bore little resemblance to their actual work. Back to waiting for the next call, the next crisis, the next situation where her particular skills would make the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. But tonight, she was still here. Still watching over the base where people she'd fought beside were settling in for another night in a war zone, still carrying the weight of the lives she'd saved and the lives she'd taken to save them. The helicopters lifted off one by one, navigation lights blinking as they gained altitude and banked toward their objectives. Giada watched until they disappeared into the darkness, then turned and walked back toward her quarters. She had packing to finish, reports to finalize, a rifle to clean one more time before the long journey home, and somewhere in the back of her mind, the knowledge that this was what she'd signed up for. This was the job. This was the life. And she wouldn't trade it for anything else. 6 months later, Giada stood on the firing line at Quantico, watching a class of new Scout sniper students work through long-range shooting problems. The Virginia morning was cool and clear. Perfect conditions that wouldn't teach them anything about how hard shooting became when conditions weren't perfect. Her official assignment these days was Advanced Marksmanship Instructor, a cover position that let her train while maintaining the fiction that she was just another skilled shooter, rather than someone who'd operated at levels most people didn't know existed. The students were good. Not great yet, but good. They had the fundamentals, the discipline, the desire to excel. What they didn't have was experience, the kind that only came from actually shooting at people who were shooting back. "Morales!" She turned to see Master Gunnery Sergeant Keller approaching, his weathered face creased with a smile. At 53, Keller had forgotten more about shooting than most people would ever learn. He'd been her primary instructor during her initial sniper training, and he'd recognized immediately that she had something special. "Gunny," she greeted him, "what brings you to my range?" "Heard you were back stateside. Thought I'd see how my star pupil was handling instructor duties." He watched the students for a moment. "They're not bad. They will be, once I'm done with them. Still the same confident Morales." He chuckled. "I also heard some interesting rumors about a convoy ambush in Afghanistan. Casualties minimized by exceptional sniper fire from an intelligence analyst who supposedly wasn't trained for combat operations." Giada kept her expression neutral. Rumors tend to get exaggerated. That's what I thought at first. Then I talked to an old friend who works in Special Operations Command. He confirmed that something unusual happened, and that the after-action reports made very interesting reading for people with the right clearances. I can't comment on classified operations. I wouldn't ask you to. Keller's smile faded into something more serious. I just wanted to tell you that I'm proud of what you've accomplished. Whatever it is you're actually doing when you're not officially doing it, you're doing it at a level most people can't even imagine. Coming from Keller, that meant something. Thank you, Gunny. You take care of yourself, Morales. People with your skills are rare, and the world needs you sharp. He walked away, leaving Jada alone with her students and her thoughts. One of the students, a lance corporal named Hayes, approached during the next break. He was young, eager, with the kind of enthusiasm that hadn't been worn down by combat yet. Ma'am, I wanted to ask about something you said yesterday, about reading terrain and understanding how environment affects ballistics. What about it? You made it sound like you could predict where bullets would drift even before you fired. How's that possible? Jada considered how to explain something that was part training, part experience, and part instinct built over thousands of rounds fired under every possible condition. It's pattern recognition, she said finally. When you've shot enough rounds in enough different conditions, your brain starts to build a database of how variables interact. Wind speed, temperature, humidity, altitude, time of day, they all matter, and they all work together in predictable ways. Once you internalize those patterns, you stop consciously calculating and start just knowing. How many rounds does it take to build that database? More than you want to shoot, less than you need to shoot. Hayes laughed. That's not helpful, ma'am. No, but it's honest. There's no shortcut to expertise. You put in the time, you shoot the rounds, you analyze your misses, and eventually something clicks. For some people it takes 10,000 rounds, for others 50,000. The only constant is that you can't skip the process. How many rounds did it take you? Jada thought about the truth, that she'd been training since she was 14, that she'd fired hundreds of thousands of rounds under every possible condition, that she'd killed people at distances Hayes couldn't imagine with equipment he'd never seen. But that truth was classified, and more importantly, it would be discouraging rather than inspiring. I'm still learning, she said instead, which was also true. Every range session teaches me something new. That's what makes this interesting. There's always room to improve, always new challenges to master. Hayes nodded, absorbing this. Thank you, ma'am. As he walked back to the firing line, Jada reflected on the strange duality of her current life. Half of her time was spent here, teaching conventional military skills to people who would use them in conventional ways. The other half was spent preparing for missions that she couldn't discuss, training for scenarios that officially didn't exist, working with equipment that had no official designation. It was exhausting maintaining the split identity. But it was also necessary. The skills she'd developed couldn't be contained within normal operational frameworks. Sometimes you needed someone who could operate in the gray areas between conventional warfare and covert operations. Someone who could look like a regular service member but perform at levels that regular service members couldn't achieve. Her phone buzzed, a secure message from an unknown number. The text was simple. Situation developing. Be ready for immediate deployment. Details to follow. Jada deleted the message and returned her attention to her students. Whatever was coming would come. For now, she had a job to do here, teaching the next generation of snipers how to place bullets exactly where they needed to go. The afternoon sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the range. Hayes settled into his shooting position, adjusting his scope and checking his wind call. Jada watched his form critically. Good body position, proper cheek weld, breathing controlled. He had potential. Take your time, she called out. Read the mirage. Feel the wind on your face. The target's not going anywhere. Hayes fired. The round impacted 2 inches low and 1 inch left of center. Good shot, Jada said, surprising him. Now tell me why it went where it went. I'm not sure. I thought I had the wind call right. You did. But what about the temperature? The sun's been baking that target for 3 hours now. The air above it is hotter than the air around it. What does that do to your bullet? Understanding dawned on Hayes's face. Thermal lift. The bullet rises as it passes through the heated air. Exactly. Now adjust and shoot again. The next round was dead center. Jada smiled. This was the part of the job that felt clean, passing knowledge forward, training the next generation, helping them avoid the mistakes that could get them killed. No classified operations, no double identities, just straightforward instruction that made people better at their jobs. But even as she taught, part of her mind was already spinning up for whatever mission that text message had hinted at. Somewhere in the world, a situation was developing that would require her particular skill set. Someone was going to need precision fire under impossible conditions. Someone was going to need a shooter who could do things that shouldn't be possible. And when that call came, Jada Morales would be ready. Because that was who she was, not just an instructor, not just an intelligence analyst, but a weapon that could be deployed when conventional options failed, a solution to problems that couldn't be solved by regular means, the quiet professional, the hidden asset, the woman who'd saved a convoy of SEALs and then disappeared back into her cover identity like she'd never been there at all. As the afternoon wore on and her students continued their training, Jada felt the familiar anticipation building. The next mission was coming, the next impossible shot, the next moment where everything would depend on her ability to place a bullet exactly where it needed to be, under conditions that would make most shooters give up before they started. She was ready for it. She was always ready. That was what separated her from everyone else on this range, from almost everyone in the military. She didn't just train for the mission, she lived for it, craved the challenge, needed the validation that came from doing impossible things and making them look routine. The sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Jada called an end to the day's training and watched her students police their brass and clean their weapons. Tomorrow they'd be back, working on the next set of skills, pushing themselves toward the standard of excellence that separated good shooters from great ones. But tomorrow Jada might not be here. Tomorrow she might be on a plane to somewhere that didn't officially exist, preparing for a mission that would never make it into any report, using skills that officially she didn't possess. The duality was exhausting, but it was also exhilarating. Because Jada Morales knew something that most people never learned. She knew exactly who she was and exactly what she was capable of. And that knowledge, that absolute certainty of purpose and ability, was worth more than any medal, any commendation, any official recognition. She was a weapon, a precisely calibrated instrument designed for a very specific purpose, and somewhere in the world, someone was about to need exactly what she could provide. The range emptied as students headed back to barracks. Jada lingered,